Gonna share my I'm gonna share my screen and let me know if this, I think that worked. Um, okay, and move this.
There, that's good.
You could see it?
Yes.
Okay. Um, Okay, I'm just trying to move this to the side. So, what I'm going to talk about today probably deserves a semester-long class, but I'm going to do it in 15 minutes and let me know when I'm getting to the end of my time and I'll skip ahead. So, basically, I'm going to give you the quick history of racism, criminalization, and what's called remote control, meaning the US externalizing its immigration enforcement to other countries in US immigration policy. So let me begin with the 1790 Naturalization Act. So most people who talk about immigration will focus on Chinese exclusion, late 19th century, when the federal immigration bureaucracy really begins. But if we turn back to the policies surrounding immigration, we can go all the way back to 1790, where the Naturalization Act restricted the right to naturalization to any alien being a free white person. So essentially, from the very beginnings of this nation, the idea of whiteness was associated with citizenship. And over time, that's eroded in various ways. But that we could see that going all the way back to 1790 with this Naturalization Act. If we fast forward ahead to 1803, there was an Immigration Act that prohibited enslaved and free blacks, mulattoes, and other persons of color from entering the United States wherever a state law prohibited their entry. So essentially, the federal government kind of backing up what some states in, especially in the South, were doing to prevent the entry of free black and mulattoes, worried about rebellion that might ensue, especially subsequent to the Haitian Revolution, which happened in 1791. Fears of that sort of rebellious attitude by formerly enslaved Black people and free Black people would come into the US. In 1822, there was a Negro Seaman Act in South Carolina that prohibited free Black sailors and other ship workers from entering the state's ports. Um, and there were any Black ship worker unlawfully docked in one of the state's ports was subject to mandatory detention in a local jail, and their ship captain was required to pay all fees associated with their incarceration. So if we think about detention, deportation, in various ways, this goes back directed specifically against Black people in the early 19th century. Now, moving ahead, I think most of us are familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, but prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was an act in 1862 known as the Anti-Coolie Act, which was preventing the importation of what were considered cheap Chinese contract laborers as akin to slavery. So that was prohibiting them. 1875, the Page Act sort of focused on single Chinese women who were seen as prostitutes, so preventing their entry. And then finally, we have the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which focused on Chinese laborers and banned them outright from coming into the country. This is an image from McNeil Island Prison, which is just off the coast of Tacoma. So in the 1880s, we saw that poster from Tacoma. People in the communities all along the West Coast, upset that Chinese were still in their communities, began to push them out of their towns, and judges began to incarcerate Chinese people found in their communities. So these Chinese people were sent to McNeil Island Prison on this remote prison off the coast of Tacoma, and held there on a variety of different immigration charges, essentially unlawful presence in the country. Now, if you look at this map, this shows after Chinese exclusion how Chinese came in. They were coming in through Canada, Mexico, Cuba, and then they would make their way to the United States either by land or by sea. And so the US, it attempted to externalize its borders by pressuring governments in neighboring countries, Canada, Mexico, and Cuba, to basically enforce Chinese exclusion. They managed to convince Canada in the 1880s to implement a head tax, which was a sort of fee the Chinese would have to pay to enter into Canada. And you actually have U.S. immigration agents stationed in Canada in the late 19th century. The sort of Immigration Bureau was building U.S. detention facilities there, which we see today with, if you go to Canada, you do customs in Canada to get into the United States. Finally, in 1923, Canada does agree to Chinese exclusion. So in that case, the US externalization succeeded. If we look at other examples like Cuba, 1902, Chinese exclusion is incorporated into Cuba. And of course, those of you who know your history know that Cuba was then under US military occupation. So essentially, the US military imposed Chinese exclusion on Cuba. In Mexico, it was a little bit different. There was resistance to imposing Chinese exclusion in the late 19th century, but in the 1920s, in the midst of a revolutionary nationalist fervor, the Mexicans do incorporate anti-Chinese restrictions. And then in the 1930, they purged Chinese from some of the northwestern states in China, pushing them out of those states. So we could see that Chinese exclusion is not only happening around the borders of the United States, but is actually externalized, and is the U.S. is pressuring these other countries to implement similar policies. Okay, so let's move on from there into the early 20th century. What we get is that idea of remote control being operationalized through systems of visas, passports, and then private contractors. So after 1918, passports were regularized and the visa system was established. You would have, once an immigrant got to the United States, they went through a screening process, usually for health-related issues in the early 20th century. But the rejection rates were actually pretty low, at least in Ellis Island, only 1% of the people who arrived were rejected. Angel Island in San Francisco, where most of the Chinese and Japanese people came in, the rejection rate was much higher, 18%. But most of the exclusion was happening offshore, was happening before people even got on the ships. And this was done through public health service officers who would vet basically prospective migrants coming to the US and would either approve them or disapprove them based on their health status. So 65% of applicants in China and Japan were rejected that way. So we could see this sort of the way this played out in this statement from Secretary of State Robert Lansing to President Wilson in 1919, who said, "It is much easier to refuse a visa than to deny admittance to the suspected person after he has arrived at a port of entry of the United States." So in other words, the government recognized that preventing people from getting to the shores of the US was an easier way to exclude people. And we could see that that continues to this day, where most exclusion is actually happening not at the border, but before people even can leave their home countries. In June of this year, the Supreme Court ruled in the Munoz decision that courts were not able to review the constitutionality of visa denials, even if it impacts a US citizen through marriage or some other way. So it means that not only are these people being excluded, but there's no review over those consular decisions. They're kind of arbitrary and happen in the shadows. Okay, so if we move then to the first major immigration restriction after Chinese exclusion, it was in the 1920s, the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act. This is the act that established national quotas based on 2% of the population in the country in 1890. So the 1890 date was chosen because they wanted to limit the quotas for Southern and Eastern Europeans. It was basically selecting for Northern Western Europeans. There was an Asian ban, and the Johnson-Reed Act also severely limited the entry of Black people. So we could see in this, although it was not entirely focused on non-white people, there was sort of within that category of whiteness a determination that there were preferable whites, those from Northern Western Europe, and then those less desirable, quote unquote, white people, Jews, Southern and Eastern Europeans, who were still legally white, but kind of not considered quite white in the same way that British people, for instance, were. Okay, so one thing that the Johnson-Reed Act does is it actually exempts people from the Western Hemisphere from these quotas. So that means that Mexicans were exempted because the farm lobby said we need all these Mexican laborers to come in. And so Mexicans were not part of that 1924 quota restriction. But in 1929, with the demands of people who were very explicitly eugenicists and racists, they start to criminalize unlawful entry. And this was led by South Carolina Senator Coleman Livingston Blease. And essentially, this was the criminalization of illegal entry was focused on Mexicans. So Mexicans were made up about 85% of these charges in the early 1930s. Um, okay, how am I doing on time? Where am I? 2 minutes. Okay, skipping ahead. Um, the McCarran-Walter Act was eliminated the prohibition on Asian immigration, but then it assigned a very low quota of 100 to Asian Pacific Triangle nations. They maintained the 1924 quota system, and Adam Clayton Powell, a New York representative, said of the law that the 1924 law early achieved notoriety for the racist sentiments which engendered it and the Ku Klux Klan support which ensured its passage. The McCarran-Walter bills perpetuate the obvious racist discrimination, and by doing so reaffirm a bias against Negro immigration, which should have been repudiated long ago. McCarran-Walter, or McCarran himself, made statements that might sound familiar if you listen to the news and the Republican candidate Donald Trump. McCarran said the United States was besieged by millions and millions of people who were able to pollute the bloodstream of our country. If we scrap the national origins formula, we will, in the course of a generation or so, change the ethnic and cultural composition of this nation. So let me skip ahead. 1965 to the Hart-Celler Act eliminated the national quota. So facially, all of a sudden, you have neutral quotas, which are equivalent for all of the countries. But what this law does is, in fact, slams the door shut on Mexican migration, whose numbers were historically much larger. And specifically, it increases the charges for illegal entry. And so that ends up becoming targeted specifically against Mexicans. So if we look at who the enforcement of all of these measures ends up affecting, even if the law is facially neutral. We could see that deportation and detention impacts over 90% Black and brown people. So even if the law is facially neutral, the outcome of it is clearly discriminatory. We could see in terms of the criminalization, this is a chart showing illegal reentry prosecutions, which accounted for nearly half of all criminal immigration charges in 2011 and 1/4 of all federal prosecutions. So increasingly, this has become a huge system. I think Juliet will talk more about that. Um, I just want to, do I have a minute or 30 seconds? Okay, so just to end, um, I talked about remote control in the late 19th century, early 20th century. This is continuing to happen. What this chart shows, the dark bar is US um, deportations of people from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras in Central America. And the sort of shaded gray bars is Mexico's returns. So what the US has done is funneled millions of dollars to Mexico to outsource its immigration enforcement. And you could see that since 2001, Mexico has in fact done the vast majority of deportation and detentions of people from Central America. So the US is basically trying to prevent them from arriving at the border and outsourcing that to Mexico. And then the data from 2023 shows that Mexico detained over 780,000 migrants. 2000 this year, it's set to double that pace. So a rapid increase of sort of outsourcing of that immigration system onto Mexico. And let me finally just end here with a horrible image that we all saw in Del Rio, Texas, September of 2021, with Haitian migrants being attacked, assaulted by Border Patrol officers on horseback. And on the right, what you see is a commemorative pin that was issued not formally by the CPB, but by people who support the Border Patrol, which says United States Border Patrol, honor will always be first. And then on the back of it, it says reining it in since May 28th, 1924, when the Border Patrol was established. And then it said yesterday's border is not today's border. So just to conclude, there's basically a through line from the beginning of this nation up until today that immigration policy has been directed against restricting, excluding non-white people and the other, and criminalizing them for the act of migration, and then also externalizing US borders to other countries. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, I have to unmute, but thank you so much. It's such a toes in the water into a deep well of information and a long history of border control. So thank you so much for that excellent introduction. Moving on to our second speaker is now Juliet Stumpf. She holds the Edmund O. Belsheim Professor of Law Chair at Lewis and Clark Law School. Stumpf is a scholar of immigration law, and her research seeks to illuminate her studies with interdisciplinary insights. She's been recognized as one of the 10 most cited immigration law scholars in the United States. Stumpf is part of several international networks of immigration scholars, and here in Portland, she serves on the board of directors of the Innovation Law Lab, which provides legal services for immigrants in the area. Professor Stumpf will now widen our lens to take a look at some of the international trends and issues that are affecting the status of immigration policies in the States. Over to you.
Thank you, Linda. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay, great. Well, I just wanted to start by saying thank you to Linda and to the League for inviting me to join this panel. As I was telling them, the League has actually been part of my life since I was quite young, because my mother, who has joined us for this, she's Dottie Stumpf, has been a League member and active in the organization since I can remember. So thank you. And I'm actually going to pick up where Elliot has left off. He's given me a great jumping off point after an incredible compressed 15 minutes of U.S. immigration history. And I want to pick up, I want to first of all tell you where we're going. So I'm going to share my slides. Hold on a sec. This should work. That.
Okay, that's pretty close. You still see
Yep.
the not full
quite it.
screen.
Let me see if I can get, see if this will work. That's not working either, is it?
No. Now, just for the record, this did work before we started, so.
I think if you open it up and then you just click on that project button at the bottom, it'll go to full screen.
Okay. I'm stuck in share somehow. Let me just get out of that.
Okay.
There we go. This should work.
Just for the record, this will not come off your time.
Appreciate that.
You're looking good.
Okay, great. Great. Then what I want to do is actually just start. I'm going to start by telling you where I'm going, which is that what I want to really quickly lay out is picking up, as I said, from where Elliot laid off, kind of took us, a couple of ideas about modern U.S. immigration law and the fact that even though right after 1965, immigration law is supposed to be neutral on its face, as Elliot shows us, it's very much racialized in effect. And I want to talk about the way that that actually works out in the law as racialization in design. Then what I'll talk about is the way that immigration law has become what I've been calling crimmigration law. That's the intersection of immigration and criminal law and policy, and give you a sense of how crimmigration law has diffused, as Ayelet Shachar talks about, the diffusion of laws and norms beyond U.S. borders, and in particular to the global South. So I will start, as I said, with the 1965 law. Elliot kind of gave us a sense of what that was. It was supposed to, as part of the civil rights era, and it was supposed to remove racial quotas. It was supposed to make our immigration laws racially neutral. But what had happened is that it simultaneously created unauthorized immigrants. And it did that by, in repealing those national origin quotas, which had to that point ensured that legal immigration to the United States was primarily reserved to Western European immigrants. The 1965 law, the neutral on its face part of it was to say that there's an annual cap of about 170,000 visas for immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere. But for the first time, it established a cap of 120,000 visas on the Western Hemisphere. So no single country was allowed more than 20,000 visas, and that was regardless of its size or historical relationship with the US. But what Elliot has just taught us is that as a result of Mexican and American policies, especially the Bracero program, which had allowed guest workers to come to the United States, there were far more than 20,000 Mexican nationals coming to the United States on a regular basis to work, especially in agriculture. So that back and forth migration was very well established, and it continued after that quota, that 20,000 visa quota was established, even after that point in time. So Mexico went from annual access of about 450,000 guest worker visas and theoretically an unlimited number of permanent resident visas to that much smaller 20,000 resident visas and no guest worker visas at all. So what we ended up with was this population of undocumented immigrants continuing to come to the United States to fill those jobs. And that rising immigration, illegal immigrant population laid the groundwork for what I've been calling crimmigration. So actually, immigration was not that much in the public eye in those early years. It wasn't really until the war on drugs began in the late 1980s through the 1990s and then the early 2000s. It was the war on drugs that really heavily impacted the creation of crimmigration. So as a matter of statute, starting in the late 1980s, but especially in 1996, 2000, Congress passed a series of laws that were expanding the grounds for excluding non-citizens and deporting non-citizens based on crime, and a wide variety of crimes. So there had been grounds for deportation based on crimes, but now Congress had created these categories, including a category called aggravated felonies, which empowered immigration officials to arrest, detain, and deport non-citizens with very little process, very few procedural protections, and very quickly. So to some extent, right, that change actually sounds like a really good thing. It seems like it makes sense to remove people who have committed crimes, punish them by deporting them for those crimes, and prevent them from committing more crimes in the United States. And aggravated felonies sound really bad, but what Congress had done was to expand these crime-based grounds so much that it included people who actually hadn't been convicted of crimes, but were suspected by immigration officials of having committed them, crimes that were minor or misdemeanors, or had been committed decades ago. So that included, for example, crimes like shoplifting or DUI convictions. And because those laws were retroactive, they could reach back to crimes that had been committed when those crimes were not deportability grounds. And as I said, ones that had been committed potentially decades before. Along with that, Congress also wiped away almost any consideration of family ties or mitigating circumstances, reasons why we might, even though somebody had committed a crime, want them nevertheless to stay in the United States. Questions about hardship to the non-citizen, or the fact that that person might be key to the survival and the thriving of American U.S. families. As a result, those crime-based deportation grounds affected almost exclusively lawful permanent residents because it was easier to use other kinds of grounds, right, to try to deport other people. So all of a sudden, there were tremendous numbers of lawful permanent residents who were being detained and deported. And that exacted a sort of banishment for lawful permanent residents, something that the Supreme Court had said was unconstitutional, an unconstitutional punishment if it was applied to U.S. citizens. So as a matter of statute, right, Congress put that into place. But the second major crimmigration expansion was based in immigration policing. So there was massive increases in the amount of dollars and resources that were put into, in particular, interior immigration enforcement. Right now, the agency that we look to for that is ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, part of the Department of Homeland Security. And that massive increase in agency resources, Elliot has already shown you a slide establishing how much deportations increase. And I'm going to show you something similar that's really tied to that increase in statutory expansion of crimmigration. So you can see after 1995 and 1996, that massive rise in the number of deportations. There's a similar slide that I could show you on detentions as well. Then in 2011, under the Bush administration had started this program, but the Obama administration really expanded a program that it was called Secure Communities. And it closely connected immigration officials, so immigration enforcement officials, with state and local police. It enabled the immigration officials to ask, right, police officers, sheriffs, police departments to hold non-citizens in custody that ICE had identified as potential deportation, right, suspects. And that enabled, again, a tremendous expansion of immigration detention and deportation. It also had a huge racial effect, and that's for two reasons. On the immigration law side, in the 1970s, the Supreme Court had allowed immigration officials to explicitly use race as a factor in making an immigration arrest. Immigration arrests are actually administrative arrests. They're not criminal arrests. So an immigration official could use race in determining whether somebody was suspected of being in the country without authorization. So the combination of that ability to arrest on the basis of race, the expansion of immigration policing into communities all across the United States, police were doing the immigration policing job as well, really kind of, I think, shifted the understanding of who immigrants were in the public eye from sort of hardworking, if sort of in the shadows, population of non-citizens, to people who had some association with crime. So it sort of branded the population of immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, as criminal or criminal-like. So we've got these sort of criminal associations. And it also combined immigration policing with criminal policing. And I think we all have an understanding already of how much criminal policing in the United States has severe racial consequences, right? We see, as Elliot pointed out, the arrest and conviction of especially Black non-citizens and US citizens, and that was also increasing for the Latina community as well. So immigration law was permitting explicit racial selection. It doubled down on the racial impact of immigration policing. So what I want to move to is the way in which this kind of immigration, both on the law side and in sort of our understanding of immigrants as criminals or having criminal association, has had international effects, how that's diffused beyond. One of the things that we know from a recent study in the Netherlands is that a similar sort of immigration criminal force that's being used to police the interior of the Netherlands has taken on both sort of a criminal and immigration role. In theory, under the Schengen Agreement, right, Europe is only supposed to have, it's supposed to have freedom of movement within Europe and sort of a harder border, making it harder for people to cross into Europe. But the whole idea was to enable that kind of freedom of movement in order to enhance the economy of Europe as a whole. But what we're seeing is the creation of internal immigration policing forces, like the one that we see with the Dutch police. And what this study has shown is that immigration officials there were, in the name of Dutch security, national security, stopping, detaining, and deporting non-citizens or suspected non-citizens based on skin color and suspected nationality, right? Singling out especially people that were perceived as African or Middle Eastern, right? Sometimes looking at the nationality on the license plate and comparing that with the skin color of the people inside the car. So a couple of examples of that kind of immigration, but in particular in the way that immigration has expanded beyond US borders in externalizing US borders and the borders of other countries. We certainly see that in the United States under the Trump administration. And again, I think we're seeing something similar under the Biden administration. We used to, in the United States, when dealing with asylum seekers, see that as a humanitarian issue, right? So we detained asylum seekers, but within the United States, and then provided them an opportunity largely to argue that they were entitled to asylum in the United States. what we've seen with efforts under Title 42 and under more recent laws under Section 212F, which gives the president sort of almost a blanket authority to keep people from crossing the border, is to move people from detention and adjudication within the U.S. border to outside of the U.S. border, right? Mass exclusion and prosecution. And so we see that as well, I think, with ways in which global North immigration priorities have started to become domestic policy, especially in global South countries. So we see that, for example, with Australia. Australia, the United States, and the European Union have sought to impose immigration controls well before an individual arrives at the global North nations' borders. So Australia notoriously has done this with asylum seekers by creating island encampments outside of Australia and detention in Papua New Guinea and Nauru, so that nobody actually arrives at the Australian border with an entitlement to ask for asylum there. We've seen this with the US placing pressure, especially under the Trump administration, on Mexico, threatening to impose tariffs on Mexico unless Mexico stops immigration passage through the country. And so Mexico has ramped up its policing on its southern borders in order to keep people from coming here. And I'll end with one last example, something that I really just discovered maybe about a year ago, which is something that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has created called transnational criminal investigative units. So in 2011, Congress authorized the creation of transnational connections between our interior immigration enforcement officials, ICE, and foreign police. So ICE began establishing these transnational criminal units in Latin America, Afghanistan, other nations. They're supposed to be pursuing human smuggling, trafficking, and other types of cases like that. But by 2023, ICE announced that it had more than 600 vetted and trained foreign law enforcement officers in 15 locations. And the largest of those was the US Guatemala Transnational Criminal Investigative Unit. So in 2019, when caravans of Central American workers sought safety by traveling together to the United States, the use of these units spiked. And what's happened most recently, and I'll end with this, is that in just last year in 2023, Congress authorized immigration officials to pay foreign police to operate in these units, right? It's the first time that that's happened, and it went beyond mere collaboration between our country's immigration policing. It effectively created U.S. immigration units abroad with something at stake in implementing U.S. immigration policy. And these units are located in largely global South nations. So I'll end there.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for that, the international relationship with our one. So we'll stop. Yep. Very good. We're back to us. We have one more speaker. Now I will share, we've got okay from everybody to go over a little bit. So if you do have a question past 4:30, I know the Zoom is good past that. And John did ask a question that Elliot was able to answer. So you might, if you have a question, you can pop it in and see if one of the speakers can answer it on chat. We have our final speaker is going to be bringing this all back here, home. Portland-born Benjamin Ficklin arrived at the Interfaith Movement for Immigration Justice here in Portland after years of border justice organizing with the South Texas Human Rights Center. Beyond running what's called Emerge's accompaniment program, they focus on grassroots community organizing with the International Migrants Alliance and disaster relief mutual aid campaigns. Ficklin is also a published poet. Their life as a poet informs their organizing. Their hope for a better world is continually transformed by poetry, and their published books include The West and a cynical view of dystopian America. At Emerge, they work running the accompaniment program, which is a direct service program that supports migrant community members when attending mandatory immigration proceedings. Benjamin, please share with us what you're seeing in your work with the interfaith movement for immigration justice here in Portland.
I will. Thank you, Linda. Can everybody see my screen right now? Great. Yeah, and a huge thank you to Juliet and Elliot and the League for inviting me in right now. Let me start my timer so I don't go over time. Yeah, my name is Benjamin. Here through an invitation that we got at the for Emerge, the Interfaith Movement for Immigrant Justice. And while I think Elliot did an excellent job of talking about the history of racializing immigration within this country and the inherent white supremacy in the US's immigration and citizenship policies, and Juliet did an excellent job of talking about kind of the exporting of US border policing. I'm going to try to move us to the interior and look at what does border policing look like both on the actual border and then within the interior of the United States, and how is that impacting our communities, both as non-migrant citizens with people with citizenship privilege, and then migrant communities that are living internally within the US. And so I'll start off just talking a very little bit about the kind of iconic part of the border area, which is down at the very, very, very bottom of Texas there. You see within the red line. I worked there in South Texas for about 8 years. And so something that Juliet mentioned is the huge increase in deportations and detentions that occurred after 1994. And so in 1993 and then 1994, we saw the US government practice and then implement a series of border policies that are fundamentally grounded around the idea that if you make the Mexico-US border egregiously dangerous to cross, that people won't leave their home countries. What I've learned in my work and what I see over and over again is that what is actually happening is forced migration out of people's home countries, which then with the implementation of prevention through deterrence, people who have no choice but to cross, try to leave their homelands to find somewhere to live, end up dying along the Mexico-US border. And so my work with the South Texas Human Rights Center, we saw that over and over and over again. And this has quantitatively been found that following prevention through deterrence, there's a massive skyrocket in migrant deaths along the border. So for me, right, the number that's really close to home are those from Brooks County, where I was working with the South Texas Human Rights Center. And in 1 year, we found 126 remains in Brooks County alone, and we assume that that's probably a quarter of the amount of migrant deaths that occurred in Brooks County that year. So we could say that's probably 450 or just under 500 deaths that occurred in Brooks County in 1 year. Right, we see this militarization along the Mexico-US borders in ways that probably a lot of us are really aware of. Permanent border checkpoints, 18 that are throughout Texas alone. The border wall and border barriers have existed since prevention through deterrence in 1994, and Trump really campaigned on expanding it drastically. We know that through contracts, they were continued to get built under Biden's administration. And then living down there, you'll see it's kind of functionally these armies of enforcement down along the border, where it's everywhere from Border Patrol to local law enforcement to state law enforcement to DHS agents that are prowling the Mexico-US borderland. So I think this is like where we're all very aware of prevention through deterrence, even if not by name, by practice. We're aware of militarization on the Mexico-US border. That's been a policy upheld by Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. But I want to bring us back to this map for just another second. And it's the legal 100-mile zone where Border Patrol is allowed to operate in the United States. And so like where I brought us down along the border, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Texas, it's really iconic that's borderland. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that, in fact, the vast majority of people who are living within the US are part of that 100-mile border zone where Border Patrol is allowed to operate, right? So we who are here in Portland, Oregon, or anywhere that you see on this map, this is an ACLU map, we're all somewhere where Border Patrol is legally allowed to operate. So just like Juliet was talking about the exporting of border policing, we also have interior border policing in a way that I think a lot of people in the United States aren't aware of. And we also are surrounded by the infrastructure of what I would call the deportation industrial complex, the for-profit industry around policing and deporting people from the communities we live within. So an example of that in Portland, I'm based here in Portland right now. It's where I do a lot of my organizing. A lot of people don't realize that there's an immigration and customs enforcement building down in the southeast waterfront area. And so with the work we do within Emerge, we accompany people in and outside of these mandatory, they're called interviews. I think they're more rightfully referred to as interrogations that happen in this relatively benign looking building that's down in southeast waterfront area. You can see folks gathered outside, waiting for their mandatory hearings. And so if you go down to southeast waterfront around 7:30, 7:45 any weekday, you'll see this line of people waiting to go inside at the risk of getting detained. Similarly, in Tacoma, I thought it was really apt that Elliot shared that anti-Chinese immigrant sentiment that was happening in the Tacoma area, that really startling photo. But in Tacoma, it's still a site of detention and the policing of bodies at the risk of deportation, right? That's where the closest for-profit the immigration detention facility is up in Tacoma, Washington. It's a little over an hour drive from here in Portland. And then also in downtown Portland, we have the Portland Immigration Courthouse. The Portland Immigration Courthouse sees dozens of mandatory hearings happen all the time. This was the work that we try to do within Emerge to mitigate that harm by accompanying people in and out of these spaces. And so an example that happened maybe just a month ago was a community member who had a mandatory hearing was coming to downtown Portland to go to the courthouse, but due to traffic and car issues was running late, and the judge would have closed her case and filed her as a flight risk and set her up to be in the process of getting deported. This was a single mother of 4 kids who had every intention of going to this mandatory proceeding, but because of just human barriers, car stuff, traffic stuff, was at risk of being considered a flight risk. And so what I think that really shows, right, is that the assumption is that people are going to get deported. The machinery is built to find ways and moments in which to label someone a flight risk, detain their body, and then deport them from being able to live within the community that we're a part of. And the mechanisms for it are here in downtown, over there in Tacoma, over in southeast waterfront area. The idea of border policing being far away is kind of a misnomer in a major way. And with that, living within the 100-mile zone, right, we can also have seen in the streets of Portland, border patrol get used against citizens and non-citizens alike. So in 2020, ostensibly to protect statues, Trump sent BORTAC, or Border Patrol Tactical Unit, to Portland during the protests following George Floyd's murder. And so because we exist in that 100-mile zone, that is what allowed Trump to implement BORTAC into the streets of Portland. And so even talking about just like the immigration proceedings being an example of border violence happening in the city of Portland, well, it's not even just those immigration processing facilities. We can see it used the fact that we're ostensibly within 100 miles of a border as an excuse to deploy armed troops to the city of Portland. I want to take 1 second to watch a 1-minute long ad, a campaign ad. This is not an endorsement of anybody by any means, but it'll just transition me kind of into the last bit that I want to talk about, which is kind of the bipartisan, this goes back to John's question in chat, the kind of bipartisan support for immigration, immigration support for ICE, deportation, and prevention through deterrence. So this is just a 50-minute video or 50-second video.
On the border, the choice is simple. Kamala Harris supports increasing the number of Border Patrol agents. Donald Trump blocked a bill to increase the number of Border Patrol agents. Kamala Harris supports investing in new technology to block fentanyl from entering the country. Donald Trump blocked funding for technology to block fentanyl from entering the country. Kamala Harris supports spending more money to stop human traffickers. Donald Trump blocked money to stop human traffickers. Kamala Harris prosecuted transnational gang members and got them sentenced to prison. Trump is trying to avoid being sentenced to prison. There's 2 choices in this election. The one who will fix a broken immigration system and the one who's trying to stop her.
So I play this because I think something that's really important to when we're talking about what is the policing of immigration.
On the border, the choice
What
is
is the policing of immigration? What is the history of U.S. immigration policy, and how does that impact communities now? And we're really seeing both political parties in this moment campaign around upholding the historic border policy of increased spending, increased militarization, have more immigration agents, and be the bigger, better policer of the border than the other candidate, right? And so when we need to talk about what does it look like for immigration justice, border justice, we really need to look outside of that rhetoric of both mainstream political parties, or at least if we want to find outside rhetoric, we can't look to these policies. And what I would always encourage folks to look at is what are migrant-led organizations uplifting themselves, right? What dialogue are migrant communities themselves putting out regarding things like border violence, immigration policies, stuff like that. And so I'll just end with talking about or mentioning a few of these campaigns that exist right now, led by migrant organizations themselves. La Resistencia is a Tacoma-based grassroots migrant-led organization that's calling for closing of the Northwest Detention Center. The International Migrants Alliance is uplifting their Legalization for All campaign that is a path to legal residency for all refugees, migrant workers, asylum seekers, migrant community members in general. Our organization, the Interfaith Movement for Immigrant Justice, we're always calling on community members that have citizenship privilege to act as accompaniers. And Linda, you're welcome to share my contact information for anybody that wants to learn more about being an accompanier. And then we're also trying to build a Portland Deportation Defense Coalition. So what does it look like to actually try to change the rhetoric around this kind of deportation for profit industry that exists and really try to uplift a narrative of deportations are inhumane. And so that's a coalition of 19 organizations, many of whom are migrant-led organizations themselves. How am I doing on time, Linda? Do I have another minute or am I donezo?
Oh, you can wrap it up now. Yes.
Cool. I'll wrap it up now. So yeah, I think the last beat that I want to end on is that a lot of this infrastructure that we're talking about within internal policing is relatively new. ICE was only started 21 years ago. I'm 33 years old, so right, I'm older than ICE is. Similarly, prevention through deterrence was passed in 1994. I'm older than prevention through deterrence is. These are policies that don't have to exist. Historically, they didn't exist. And I think, sometimes exist in the political sphere where they're taken for granted. But in reality, these things are very, very new. And there's a lot of conversations happening around what we could do alternatively than police immigration. Last thing I'll do, the URL that you see right here is an opportunity to learn a lot more about everything that Juliet, Elliot, and I talked about today, which is this incredible film called Borderland: The Line Within. It's about both policing of borders in the global South, like Juliet talked about, the history of immigration policy, like Elliot talked about, and then internally, what does it look like to police immigration, and then what do we do to organize against it? So there's that bit.ly down that you can see on screen right there, and tickets are as low as $9, and really, really encourage y'all to come join. It's an incredible film. It's probably the best educational film I've ever seen on the Mexico-US border. And with that, I'll end, and thanks again, Linda.
Oh my God, this is so fantastic. And I want to invite the whole international relations interest group to give a round of applause to our three speakers. Come on, let's see it. Applause. Yep. Okay. And we have time for a few questions, and I've got a dozen, but I'll open it up. So Sophie, you're up. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
No, I didn't have a question. I was sending applause.
Oh, okay. I like that.
Questions may come later.
Well, yes. I mean, I know Ken, I believe you had a question that Elliot answered. Or John, do you want to pose your question to see? Oh, you're on mute. There we go.
This is really great. The one thing I would like to say is, along with comparing the political parties, their messages, go to their platforms and actually see what their platforms support or are talking about, but then also compare them with your values, compare them with, I hate to say it, but 2025, and see how much each possibly aligns. I'm Roman Catholic, and I know this is non-partisan, most likely non-religious, but what I'm going to do is compare that with Catholic social teaching in terms of the dignity of the human person and protecting the poor and the vulnerable, and see how they line up. See how they line up. So that's
I would also add, in addition to the platforms and kind of the rhetoric of the various candidates, to actually look at the policies, because in past presidents we've seen, the rhetoric is different on between the two major parties, but that if you actually look at the policies, if you look at deportation numbers, there's often very little difference. So sometimes the rhetoric, there's a gap between the rhetoric and the practice.
Or the thing is look at what they say, look at what they've done, and look at what they plan to do or say to do, and stay with them. Enter into a dialogue.
Juliet or Benjamin, you want to add anything? And the policies, one policy is deportation of all immigrants, and the number keeps going up. I think when it started out, it was 11 million, and I think I heard in one debate something like 40 million. So one of your stats, Juliet, showed 500,000 being deported in a year. Is there a mechanism? Is the mechanism there with the current setup to deport 41 million people?
The short answer is no. I mean, I think, Benjamin put up that really useful slide talking about how much, I think it was 6.7 million or $7.6 billion is going into the immigration enforcement side right now. But there's kind of two ways of thinking about that. Number one is, if we actually tried to deport the entire population of undocumented immigrants, or an even larger population, which would be the entire population of deportable immigrants, is that possible? That's kind of what I'm understanding your question, Linda. And the answer is not really, right? We would have to increase our immigration enforcement even more than we have. And we might have to do some things that are kind of on the shady constitutional side, which is to require state and local police in some way to get involved with that, and a whole lot of other people. Perhaps we get hospital workers to get engaged in the project of deporting immigrants. We could get librarians and landlords engaged. So, and I say this not because it's sort of some hypothetical dream, but because communities have tried to use exactly these workers, right? These sort of people who are in our community to get engaged in the project of deporting or deterring undocumented immigrants and other immigrants. So that's one question, is whether we even have the capacity to do that. Currently, no. And then the second one is, what would it look like if we did? And given that so many children, U.S. citizen children in our country, live in mixed status families, in other words, families in which there's at least one undocumented immigrant and the rest of the family either has U.S. citizenship or lawful permanent resident status or some other lawful status, the result would basically, to actually accomplish that goal, would be to be tearing apart families in ways that I think we as a country have decided was a bad idea, right? And when we came upon separation of families under the Trump administration, there was a unified cry that was not where we should go. And we can kind of imagine other consequences as well.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Judy's got a question. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Thank you. So is it part of our species' genetic makeup to hate others? Have we been behaving like this for 30,000 years? And
No, I'll take this one. I'm so happy to take
okay,
this one. No, vehemently no. I think the amount of institutionalized structures that go toward othering people, the amount of effort it takes to convince humans to other and dehumanize other humans, I think speaks for itself, in that it is not the way that we are created. Physiologically. We are physiologically inclined to see humanity in other humanity, and it's taken massive effort over and over again from monarchy to contemporary white supremacist institutions to dehumanize other people. It is, I think, by no means our nature. And I think in relating that back to immigration policy, humanity's been migrating for as long as we've been a species. There's just evidence of that as far back as any of our archaeological records, that we're animals that move in mass, and we're a species that moves in mass. So even the idea of policing borders to control migration is in terms of the scale of humanity, a relatively new, and in that lens also like a really inhumane idea. It's so against kind of who we are physiologically. I don't know if that was quite the answer you were looking for, Judy, but
oh, I like your
Wonderful.
answer. Thank you.
I want to pose that to both Elliot and Juliet. So Elliot, your tag?
Yeah, I mean, I think Benjamin put it eloquently. I don't think it's genetic, natural, and that's why it's important to sort of look at history and look at how are these systems built over time. What was the rhetoric used by eugenicists in the late 19th, early 20th century to talk about the pollution of the blood of the nation, ideas which are now being resurrected by candidates. So these are all ideas which are made by particular humans with particular interests. I don't think there's anything natural about them, but I do think that right now, this political moment is one in which both major political parties are contributing to the dehumanization of migrants. And so what we're seeing in the polls is there's increasingly anti-immigrant sentiment among people, and also support for deportation of those without status in the country. And that's shifted. Actually, during Trump, there was increasing support for immigrants, and now there's decreasing support. So we have to question, like, what are the political factors that have made that a reality now?
All right, Juliet, you get the last word on it. Is this who we are, or?
Yeah, Judy's question is very, very close to my heart. And actually, because my sister and I are actually engaged in a project to figure out the connection between evolutionary biology and migration. And our thesis actually was very eloquently just stated by Benjamin. They said, we really need to think about how migration matches up with immigration policing. And what we know, she's the evolutionary biologist, and she can tell you that our bodies are actually constructed in order to migrate. What we eat, the way that we walk and run, we have evolved in order to use migration as an evolutionary advantage. So if that's true, and migration and not hatred is part of the sort of DNA of our species, then we really need to be looking at the contours of our immigration laws through the lens of evolutionary biology, and migration as something that we have absolutely used as an adaptation, and that has led us to every corner of every continent except Antarctica.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. All right, Sophie, I see your hand.
Yeah, so I was wondering if somebody wanted to maybe comment about the difference between what's happening in the US and in Europe right now.
Okay. Well, I'll send that back to Juliet. You covered some of that. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. I've actually been really interested in the different ways in which we have conceptualized, especially asylum seekers, humanitarian protection in the United States versus the European Union. Because I think we have shifted in major ways in our understanding and treatment of asylum seekers, and the European Union has in many ways as well. So just to really try to answer your question as briefly as possible, I think we used to, as I said in my talk, I think we used to kind of think about asylum seekers in the United States as a place of refuge for people who were seeking safety from political persecution, religious persecution, et cetera, and that now that perception has shifted more into a immigration paradigm where people who are seeking asylum are not really doing that. It's really an economic rationale. And there's some falsity to those, right, to those stories about asylum. I think Elliot's work in being an expert witness for asylum seekers has been amazing with respect to this. But that attitude has really shifted in, I think, ways which are dangerous to our commitment to, right, to hosting refugees, to welcoming refugees. In Europe, there are ways in which the law protecting asylum seekers in Europe is actually stronger than US law. So, for example, laws that prevent deportation of family members are stronger in Europe under the European law, EU law, than they are here. But Europe, I think, has for much longer thought about asylum seekers as unwanted, undesirable, and have put into place a lot more sort of hardening of the external borders of Europe. So keeping people from trying to cross, the Mediterranean, from trying to cross from Africa, and doing that in ways that have been troubling from a human rights perspective. So I think that's very much an internal dialogue, I think, that's going on within the European Union and its commitment to human rights. And I think that's going to continue to go forward, especially as we understand asylum seekers as being composed of, like in the US, Black and brown people from Latin America, and in Europe, Romanians, Eastern Europeans, and people of color.
Okay, thank you. Okay, everybody, I promised our speakers just an hour, so they have generously given a little bit more than that. I'd like you to have the last word on on a question, if you can share, and then if the committee wants to stay on for a few more minutes, we can talk about our next meeting. But I want to ask the three of you, and we can go back in reverse order. So we'll start with Benjamin, and then Juliet, and then Elliot. What would a just and humane immigration policy look like in the United States through your lens?
Yeah, I love this question because of how utopic it allows us to be, but it's also, I worry about not being able to talk about it longer because I think that this is
Get 30 seconds.
I know it's a utopic vision, but it's possible. But I think borders, having worked on one for nearly a decade, are inherently violent. I think the more that we militarize them, the more we're setting up people for suffering of pain and violence. And so I think I look at the International Migrants Alliance recent call going into this election, which is path to legalization for all folks and decriminalization of migration. So I think short of abolishing borders, which is also a thing I support, but maybe it won't happen as quickly. I think immediate path to legalization for all is something that is hugely necessary.
Thank you. Juliet.
Yeah, so jumping off of where Benjamin was coming from, I think in thinking about if we kind of took our immigration system as it was, right, if we couldn't change it in terms of the admissions laws that we have, then what we really need to do is, I think, change the way that we, the processes that we're actually using in order to make our immigration system work. So I'm kind of imposing a constriction on myself. But one thing I think that's really important to think about is right now we've put all these resources into keeping people out, right? So ramping up Border Patrol, ramping up ICE, and throwing people out, while not putting into place enough resources to enable the rest of our immigration system to work, right? So we have too few immigration judges to adjudicate asylum and other types of cases. We have too few asylum officers, right, to do the interviews that are necessary in order to decide whether somebody has an asylum claim. We have too few of all of the other processes to even enable those who are seeking asylum or seeking lawful entry here to do that even within the next decade. I mean, that's how long cases are stacked out in order to make that happen. So I think that's one, sort of on a very practical level, how do we make that work? That's one piece of it. The other piece is I really think we need to have kind of an American reckoning about the racial nature of our immigration law and system, and see what those racial pieces are. Because once we start to see that, we really can start to see why simply trading off legalization for more immigration enforcement doesn't fix the problem.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Elliot.
Yeah, so I guess I'd like to pick up where Juliet talking about, one proposal is making the system more efficient, having more judges, et cetera. But I think part of the problem is the law itself is too restrictive. The asylum law is too restrictive. It doesn't account for people in poverty, economic needs. It doesn't account for climate refugees. So I think just making the system more efficient doesn't make for a just system. So I would agree that opening up pathways for legalization within the confines of the nation state, that there's some way in which people apply for entry, and just having a much more liberal view of who gets to come in is good. But I also think we have to keep in mind sort of horizon of abolition, and that horizon would imagine a world in which there aren't nations. That horizon would imagine a world in which immigration detention just didn't exist. And while in our current political moment, those, you could be on the street corner in Portland shouting those things, but like it's not likely to happen in the foreseeable future. I think it's important to keep in mind in our, the utopian part of our brain, the world that we want to ultimately create, and then sort of build towards that.
Okay, I want to end on that note. Thank you so much to the three speakers. We're very grateful you could join our League of Women Voters interest group discussion about immigration today. We look forward to seeing you around town in person.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. And the committee members can stay on. We're going to have our next meeting will be in November. I'll send out an email to everybody, and we're going to meet at a place that Akiko suggested, that's in the Pioneer Square, for snacks and drinks. And we're going to say how these first 2